Right. Hello, everyone. My name is May. I'm one of the dietitians here over at Student Health Services. Thank you for all joining us today. Our topic today will be label reading, so cracking the code of nutrition facts labels. I know this is a topic that really gets a lot of attention and where there's often a lot of confusion and misinformation. So my goal today is to cover the following objectives to really help you build a better understanding of the nutrition facts label, to simplify label reading to reduce overwhelm, help you apply key information to support your own individual food choices. I also understand that this topic can be pretty boring, so I'll do my best to really include knowledge checks along the way to help deepen your understanding. So let's start with a picture of a basic nutrition facts label. This is what you see when looking at the back of most packaged food items. Food manufacturers are required by the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, to include a nutrition facts label for most packaged foods and beverages or beverage products sold in the United States. Exemptions to this rule typically include single ingredient foods such as produce, raw meat, coffee, foods sold in very small packages like spices or tea, foods made on site like restaurants or bakery items, or produced by small businesses. So think non-chain eateries like your local mom and pop bakery. The nutrition facts label is standardized to include specific pieces of information, such as servings per container, calories, and specific nutrients of concern and their percent daily value. We will discuss these in more detail as we go through the PowerPoint. Let's start with our first knowledge check. So which of the following food items is required by the FDA to include a nutrition facts label? So a nutrition facts label that includes protein, added sugar, sodium, etc. Do you think it's a peach, a coffee, or a bag of coffee beans, a jar of paprika, packaged chicken, raw chicken, or a Nature Valley granola bar? Feel free to just answer the question in your head. You can pop it into the chat, whatever feels most comfortable. So the answer is a Nature Valley granola bar. So fresh produce such as a peach is actually exempt from having any type of label. Foods with minimal nutritional significance, such as coffee beans or certain spices, are also exempt. Fresh meat, poultry, and seafood actually fall under USDA authority rather than the FDA, and thus have different labeling requirements, which are often less focused on nutritional content and more focused on weight, quality, and safe handling instructions. Granola bars do require a nutrition facts label because they are a packaged multi-ingredient product. Let's circle back to our food label. The first part I want to focus on is the serving size. When looking at the nutrition facts label, first take a look at the number of servings in the package, referred to as servings per container. This box of frozen lasagna contains 4 servings per container, with a serving being 1 cup. This means that the calorie and nutrients cited in the nutrition facts panel are for only 1 cup of this product. If you consume 2 servings or 2 cups, you would need to double the amount of calories, nutrients, and percent daily value cited below. If you ate the full box of lasagna, you would need to multiply this information by 4. Serving sizes are standardized to make it easier to compare similar foods. It is not a recommendation on how much you should eat or drink. For an example, an ice cream company will standardize their serving size to other ice cream companies, but other desserts that are similar, like pudding, for example, might look very different. Here's an example of why the serving size isn't a suggestion of how much you should eat. A standard serving size of cooked rice is about half a cup. For most people, this is not really nearly enough carbohydrate to support energy and glucose requirements for the meal. If you only if you only plate half a cup of rice, you will likely leave the meal still feeling hungry. All right, second knowledge check. Looking at serving sizes per container, how many grams of saturated fat are in 2 servings or 2 cups of lasagna? I'll give you a minute. 9 grams. So to figure this out, we would first see how many grams of saturated fat are included per serving. So there's 4.5 grams of saturated fat per serving. And then we'd multiply this number by servings, or the number of servings, which would be 2. This is important to note as sometimes food companies will make the serving size actually smaller to make products seem healthier or lower in calories or lower in saturated fat. Next, let's review the percent daily value. So this is what's shown in the purple on the right side of the column. Percent daily value, or percent DV, tells you how much of a nutrient one serving of food contributes toward the total amount you should eat in a day. It really helps consumers quickly determine if a food is high in a specific nutrient, defined as 20% or more of the daily value, or low in a specific nutrient, defined as 5% or less. What is important to note here is that these percentages are actually based on 2,000 calories per day and do not represent the needs of every individual person. Basically, the FDA took the average needs of a large swath of people and made that the standard. You actually may need more or less than 2,000 calories per day, depending on various factors such as physical activity level, weight, height, body mass percentage, and specific medical conditions. Next, we'll discuss calories. Calories provide a measure of how much energy you get from a serving of food. The number of calories you consume from a food depends on the number of servings you eat. If you are consuming 1 serving of lasagna, you are consuming around 280 calories. If you are consuming 4 servings of lasagna, you are consuming around 1,120 calories. It's important to note that determining calorie content of foods is not a perfect science. What's really interesting is in the US, the FDA allows a margin of error of up to plus or minus 20% for calories and nutrients listed on the nutrition facts label. This is really one of the issues with relying too heavily on calories versus internal hunger or fullness cues. This number may not be as accurate as we actually think. So for an example, if a food label says that a granola bar has 100 calories, in reality, that could actually look like 80 calories to 120 calories. On the topic of calories, calories are not inherently bad. In fact, a very nutritionally dense meal, such as a grain bowl with chicken, avocado, and veggies, might be higher in calories, but also comes with a lot of protein and fiber that keep you feeling full and satiated. If you consume a portion of chocolate candies with a similar caloric amount, you likely will not experience the same level of satiety and satisfaction and may even feel a little bit sick afterwards. It's always about balance and moderation. For individuals requiring around 2,000 calories per day, this might look like having, 500 to 600 calorie meals with a couple of 200 to 300 calorie snacks. If your needs are higher, this could look like more. I often see frozen meals containing only 200 to 300 calories and people wondering why they don't feel full after. If you're curious about this, I always recommend talking with a registered dietitian to discuss your own individual energy needs. All right, nutrients of concern are the next topic we'll discuss. The nutrients chosen to be listed on the nutrition facts label are not random. They are chosen based on public health priorities set out by the FDA and the USDA, government agencies that regulate food safety labeling and quality to protect consumers. You will notice that these nutrients are broken up into 2 subcategories, nutrients to get less of and nutrients to get more of. Nutrients to get less of include saturated and trans fat, sodium, and added sugars. These are nutrients that may be associated with more adverse health outcomes and should be consumed in moderation, with the exception of trans fat that really should be completely avoided. Nutrients to get more of are going to include dietary fiber, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. These are nutrients that Americans generally don't get enough of and are correlated with more positive health outcomes. We will go through it and touch on most of these nutrients of concern in the following slides. Let's start with saturated fat. So saturated fat is listed as one of those nutrients to get less of because it can lead to elevated LDL cholesterol and increased risk for cardiovascular disease. The dietary guidelines for Americans recommend that less than 10% of calories come from saturated fat each day, and that we try to avoid trans fat as much as possible. It's important to recognize that the recommendation is to minimize saturated fat and not remove it from the diet. Most food sources containing fat have both unsaturated and saturated fat. In fact, it's virtually impossible to completely eliminate saturated fat from the diet. One pro tip is when looking at a food label, again, that 5% or less of the percent of daily value is considered low, while 20% or more of the percent daily value would be considered high. So if you're going out and looking at a certain cut of meat to buy, that could be something you might look at. Listed here are some food sources that tend to be higher in saturated fat. Remember that frequency, so how often you are eating these foods, and portion size are really key. If you're going out to a fancy steak dinner, the half a tablespoon of butter on your green beans has about 3.5 grams of saturated fat, or about 18% of your daily value, versus that 12-ounce ribeye steak has about 48 to 60 grams of saturated fat, which is about 250 to 300% of your daily value. In this situation, it would make more sense to share the ribeye steak with a friend or family member and just keep the butter on your plate. Next, let's take a look at sodium. The dietary guidelines for Americans, the American Heart Association, and the American College of Cardiology all recommend trying to stay below 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. Excessive sodium intake is a risk factor for hypertension, which is elevated blood pressure, as well as cardiovascular disease. As with many of the other nutrients I will discuss, excessive sodium intake is only one risk factor. There are other dietary lifestyle factors that can have a large impact on blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. There are also people out there who may need more salt in their diet. It's important to get individual advice from a medical provider on this one. If you are someone trying to cut down on their sodium intake, a tip for assessing sodium content is to look at calories per serving. Select foods that have less than a 1-to-1 ratio of sodium to calories are considered, we would consider those to be low sodium foods. So for example, if this lasagna has 850 milligrams of sodium per 280 calorie serving, the ratio would be 3-to-1, making this actually a pretty high sodium food. Foods highest in sodium tend to be packaged and processed foods, such as processed meat, for example, ham, sausage, bacon, sometimes bread, cheese, certain sauces, sometimes salad dressings and snack foods, as well as restaurant foods such as pizza, burritos, etc. A big reason for high sodium content in these foods is that sodium acts as a preserving agent, so it can actually slow microbial growth and extend the shelf life of certain foods. Remember to factor in the serving size when calculating sodium content of food. Often salty foods such as canned soup list greater than 1 serving per can, even when we typically consume the whole can. So you can see here 1 serving versus it's also listing out the nutrition information for the whole thing of soup. All right, carbohydrates. So carbs are not necessarily a nutrient of concern, but are still listed on the nutrition facts label. Total carbohydrates include sugars, starches, and fiber. It's important to note that on the nutrition facts label, only dietary fiber, total sugar, and added sugar are listed as subcategories. So there effectively is no subcategory for starches. So that's why if you were to add all of these up, this would not lead to the total carbohydrate in the food. We're kind of missing that starches section. Carbs get a lot of negative press. Why are they important? Carbohydrates are the body's primary source of energy, so they fuel the brain, the nervous system, and muscles, while also providing essential fiber and micronutrients to support digestion, gut health, and overall metabolic function. So dietary guidelines for Americans recommends that 45 to 60% of total calories actually come from carbohydrates. remember that with carbohydrates, quality counts. On the left, you will notice examples of whole grains and starchy root vegetables such as whole grain bread, cereal, pasta, oats, whole potato with the skin, as well as brown rice. These foods generally have a higher fiber content, which helps slow the breakdown of carbohydrate and promote more blood sugar stability and fullness. On the right, you'll notice a more refined carbohydrate like white rice. And it's paired with a non-starchy vegetable and a protein. Even though white rice is a lower fiber carb, the addition of lots of veggies adds fiber and promotes blood sugar stability and fullness. It's also important to note that refined carbohydrates in the US, like white rice, are often enriched, which means that certain nutrients lost in the processing, such as iron and B vitamins, are added back in. Big picture, try to mostly prioritize whole grains and starchy root vegetables. However, inclusion of refined grains when paired with protein and fiber can be part of an overall healthy diet. All right, let's look at fiber as the first subcategory of carbohydrates. Fiber is a type of carbohydrate that, unlike sugar and starches, cannot actually be broken down and absorbed for energy, but instead moves through the gastrointestinal tract mostly intact. Dietary fiber reduces risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers, while also supporting weight management, blood sugar balance, cholesterol, and digestive health. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recommends that adult women consume at least 25 grams of fiber per day, while adult men consume at least 38 grams of fiber per day. While fiber recommendations are often listed separately for men and women, a more practical way to estimate needs is really just based on energy intake. A common guideline is about 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. So for instance, if someone's energy needs are around 2,000 calories per day, their fiber goals would be about 28 grams of fiber per day. It's important to note that the average American only consumes about 15 to 18 grams of fiber per day, making this a particular nutrient of concern. When looking at food labels, one pro tip is that foods with greater than 3 grams of fiber per serving are considered a good source of fiber. So if you're ever looking at a box of rice or a bread, this is something you can look at in terms of assessing, hey, is this a good source of fiber? Let's do a quick knowledge check. Which food item goes with the food label listed below? So using fiber specifically as a context clue. Also consider if this food would be considered a good source of fiber. So if you can't, it's hard to see on the left, we've got this food label and it lists 9 grams of fiber per serving of this food. It could either be this can of chicken noodle soup, or it could be this can of organic lentil soup. Give you a quick minute. So this food label belongs to the can of lentil soup. Lentils are a fantastic source of fiber. 1 cup of lentils can have as much as 15 grams of fiber, which is pretty incredible. This soup specifically has 9 grams per cup and a total of 15 grams in the whole can. Because it contains greater than 3 grams of fiber per serving, we would consider it to be a good source of fiber. Okay. Next, we will discuss total versus added sugar. This is always a pretty confusing topic, so let's clarify really what these two terms mean. Total sugar, which you'll see here, total sugar equals 6 grams, indicates all sugar present in the food or beverage. So this is both sugar that is naturally present, like lactose from dairy products or fructose from fruit, in addition to any added sugar. Added sugar indicates sugars that are added during the processing of the food. So for example, honey, table sugar, maple syrup, high fructose corn syrup, agave, fruit juice concentrate, etc. So many people find it really surprising that natural sugars such as maple syrup and honey are still considered to be added sugar. If we look at our lasagna food label, you will notice that there is some total sugar naturally present, probably due to the lactose in the cheese, but no added sugar. We didn't really add any table sugar or high fructose corn syrup to our lasagna. Dietary recommendations for Americans really only recommend the limitation of added sugar. So they suggest limiting added sugar to less than 10% of our total calorie intake. And so for most adults, this would look like about 50 grams of added sugar per day. And like I said, it's important to note that the dietary guidelines don't recommend limiting total sugar, just added sugar. To better understand this distinction, we'll compare two different brands of yogurt. So yogurt already contains natural sugar or carbohydrate in the form of lactose or milk sugar. However, the Yoplait brand contains around 14 grams of additional added sugar, whereas the Great Value brand contains 0 grams of added sugar. Both brands contain natural sugar due to the lactose. However, the Yoplait brand contains more total sugar due to the addition of the added sugar in the form of table sugar to a food already containing natural sugar in the form of lactose. In this case, we would really only want to be mindful of the added sugar in the foods. So probably the choice on the right would be the better choice here. When choosing a yogurt brand, I generally recommend the 10-10 rule. So look for something with at least 10 grams or more of protein and less than 10 grams of added sugar. This tends to strike a nice balance of having some sweetness without being overloaded with added sugar. Moral of the story, pay attention to added sugar, not total sugar. Added sugar is not inherently bad. However, too much added sugar could contribute to excess energy intake as well as blood sugar dysregulation and excess fat accumulation in the liver. Common sneaky sources of added sugar include flavored yogurts, like the one we just discussed in the previous example, salad dressings, sauces, fat-free foods, sodas, and other sweetened beverages, granola bars, sports drinks, and various desserts. My recommendation, start to become aware of where added sugar shows up in your diet and prioritize where it matters most. For example, maybe you could swap out your typical bread loaf for one without added sugar because it doesn't really alter the flavor profile too much. But having a yogurt with a little bit of added sugar for flavor and sweetness is really important to you. All right, moving on from our nutrients of concern, let's talk a little bit more about the ingredient list underneath those nutrients of concern on the food label. So ingredients are actually listed in descending order by weight, with the first few ingredients representing the largest portion or volume of the product. For this specific product, enriched cornmeal is the ingredient with the highest volume by weight versus salt is listed as the last ingredient, which indicates it has the lowest volume by weight. What about long ingredient lists or ingredients that you can't pronounce? Should you be worried about these things when looking at food labels? There are common sayings floating around, such as if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it, or the fewer ingredients, the better. Here are some examples of some lesser known food ingredients that may seem scary upon first glance. Any idea what they might be? And I'll give you a moment. And feel free to, again, add your answers to the chat, write them down, think about it in your head. Okay. So don't judge a food by its syllables. Come to find out, ascorbic acid is really just a fancy term for vitamin C, which is an antioxidant that is used to help extend the shelf life of certain foods. Tocopherols are actually a form of vitamin E, which is a fat-soluble vitamin. And they're often used as preservatives to keep oils from going rancid. Guar gum comes from guar beans and is used as a thickener or fiber and has been shown to be safe. This is often seen in a lot of plant milks. And then monocalcium phosphate is a common baking powder ingredient, which really just helps baked goods rise. My advice is prioritize whole foods most of the time, while also remembering that an ingredient being hard to pronounce doesn't make it unsafe. Often these are just vitamins, minerals, or stabilizers in disguise. When we focus too much on individual ingredients, we tend to lose sight of the bigger picture and our larger health goals. So how does the FDA regulate food ingredients? I know this is kind of boring, but it's good to know. There are two main pathways. The first is for new ingredients. Food companies must show scientific evidence that a new ingredient is safe before the FDA allows it to be used. The FDA also sets limits on how much of the ingredient can be safely consumed each day. Around 99% of food ingredients actually fall within the second pathway, or foods labeled as GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. These are considered safe based on existing research or long-term use and aren't required to go through the formal approval process listed above. This is how most new food ingredients are added today. Let's do a quick knowledge check. So which of these foods would be considered GRAS, or generally recognized as safe? Sucralose, the artificial sweetener often known as Splenda, or red wine vinegar. So the answer is actually red wine vinegar. It is generally recognized as safe or GRAS because it has a long history of safe use. Its main component, acetic acid, is well studied, and experts agree it is safe when consumed in typical amounts. The company who created sucralose, on the other hand, had to submit extensive safety research to the US Food and Drug Administration, which then reviewed the evidence and determined that sucralose is safe to use in foods within established intake limits. That doesn't mean that a lot of these foods that are added don't come with some controversy. But at this moment in time, the FDA has established that when this food is consumed in typical amounts, there are no well-defined risks to safety. All right. Another thing you might see when grocery shopping are marketing and labeling claims. So marketing claims highlight appealing product features to drive sales. So examples are made with real fruit juice and natural. They are partially regulated by the FDA and the USDA. Labeling claims provide standardized information about products' nutrients or production methods and are more strictly regulated. So examples might include gluten-free, reduced fat, or organic. It's important to note that just because a food has a specific marketing or labeling claim like gluten-free or made with real fruit juice doesn't make the food as a whole supportive to health. Let's explore some of these claims. So made with real fruit juice, in this example, it's stated on this package of fruit snacks. For this marketing claim, the food has to only contain a tiny amount of fruit concentrate or puree. So foods with this label may still have significant amounts of added sugar and lack the fiber that is naturally present in the whole fruit. Natural. In the US, natural isn't tightly regulated. So you'll see this on this bag of Cheetos. So in the US, natural isn't tightly regulated except for meat and poultry. It often just means that no artificial flavors or colors were used, but products can still have large amounts of added sugar, saturated fat, or sodium. So in this bag of Cheetos, it's possible that they used maybe beetroot extract instead of red dye number 3 to maybe color their Cheetos. But that doesn't mean that this food doesn't still have significant amounts of saturated fat, sodium, etc. Gluten-free. So this labeling claim means that the food contains less than 20 parts per million of gluten and is safe for people with celiac disease or gluten intolerance. Gluten-free diets are not inherently healthier for the general population. So something to note. Reduced fat, like we see on this jar of Jif peanut butter. This labeling claim means that the food product has 25% less fat or sodium than the original version. This doesn't necessarily make it a low-fat or sodium food overall. For example, original Jif contains 16 grams of total fat, while the reduced fat version contains 12 grams of total fat. If you're someone who is watching their fat or sodium consumption, it's probably better to look at the amount of these nutrients in the product as a whole, rather than just default going for the reduced fat or the reduced sodium version. Organic. So this labeling claim means that this product must follow specific farming standards, so no synthetic pesticides, GMOs, or certain fertilizers. Nutritionally, organic foods are usually about the same as conventional, though some people prefer them for environmental or other personal reasons. And then I don't think we have an example on here, but sometimes we see foods with a non-GMO stamp, and essentially that means that the product wasn't made with genetically modified organisms. So it doesn't guarantee the food is more nutritious or less processed. So for example, non-GMO sugar is still sugar at the end of the day. All right, if you've ever been shopping for bread, you know that there is a plethora of labeling claims out there. What is the difference between wheat bread and whole wheat bread and whole grain bread? There are just so many options. It can feel really overwhelming and confusing. So to adequately explain this topic, we need to first start with the basics. So bread and other flour products like pasta, baked goods, porridge are typically prepared using some type of a grain. In the US, we tend to use a lot of wheat, but other common grains include barley, millet, oats, rye, and even brown rice. I'm getting ahead of myself, but when you see a bread product that says multi-grain, all that means is that there's more than one type of grain present in the bread product. So for example, multi-grain bread could be made from both wheat and barley. All of these grains have three main parts. So the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. The bran is the fiber-rich outer layer that protects the seed, and it contains B vitamins and other minerals. So this is the one you see on the outside. The endosperm is the middle layer that contains most of the carbohydrate and protein. So that's going to be the majority of the inside. The germ is the small nutrient-rich core that contains antioxidants, vitamin E, B vitamins, and some healthy fats. Grains are either ground up as is, making a whole grain flour, or in the case of a refined grain, the bran and germ, so the outer layer and then that inner germ, are removed, leaving behind the starchy endosperm, which is then ground up. So this process is done to produce a lighter texture, a finer flour, and to significantly extend the shelf life of this product. When you use multi-purpose baking flour for cooking, you are typically using a product that has had the bran and the germ removed. So if you're ever making something like a cake, you're typically always using a refined product. Because the bran is where the majority of the fiber exists, the refining process yields a product lower in fiber than its original form. One thing to note is that in the US, we tend to enrich many of our refined grains, which means that the iron and other B vitamins are added back in after they've been removed. However, refined grains still lack the fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidants, and vitamin E that the original grain contained, which is why many whole grains are still consistently recommended over refined grains. Okay, so now we find ourselves picking out some bread for a sandwich. What do all these labels mean, and why does that, or what actually matters? If you see the term wheat bread, know that this is a very loosely regulated marketing term, meaning that the bread was made with at least some type of wheat flour, but this could be whole or refined. It doesn't really specify that the bread is whole grain or not. The term whole grain bread means that this product can contain some grains, but not necessarily 100% of the grains are whole grain. The term whole wheat bread means that this bread contains some wheat grain, but may also be mixed with refined grain as well. There is really no regulation around how much whole wheat grain must be present. So for example, the bread could be 70% whole wheat flour and 30% refined flour. The term whole grain bread is similar to whole wheat bread in that it contains some whole grain flour, but that could be barley, wheat, or rye, but also may be mixed with refined flour. And then we reviewed this before, but the term multi-grain bread, it's meaningless and just means that the bread has been made with two or more different types of grains, for example, refined wheat flour and barley. Bread products with the most nutrient density are going to be 100% whole grain or 100% whole wheat, which means that the product is made up entirely of whole wheat or whole grain and are generally higher in fiber and nutrients. Another thing that you can look for would be the whole grain stamp, shown here on the bottom right, from the Whole Grain Council, which indicates that 100% of the grain is whole grain. To find the most nutrient dense option, Um, to find the most nutrient dense option, I like to choose something that is either 100% whole grain or whole wheat, or something that falls within that greater than 3 grams of fiber per serving. So don't make it too complicated. Look for the whole grain stamp, look for 100% whole wheat or 100% whole grain, or look for greater than 3 grams of fiber per serving. What about sourdough? I get asked this question quite a lot. Sourdough can actually be made from virtually any type of flour. So even though wheat flour is most traditional and common, the defining characteristic of sourdough is not the type of flour used, but is instead the fermentation process, which uses a wild yeast and lactic acid bacterial starter. So health benefits of sourdough bread include some improved blood sugar response. So the organic acids produced during fermentation can help slow gastric emptying and starch digestion. So there are also some structural changes to the starch that reduce digestibility. They tend to be better, they tend to have better nutrient absorption. So again, that fermentation process breaks down a compound called phytic acid, which normally blocks your body from absorbing certain minerals like iron and zinc. And for some people, they can be a little bit easier to digest. So they may be gentler on the gut, especially for people with IBS or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And this is because the lactic acid bacteria during fermentation degrades some of those FODMAP foods, or particularly fructans, which can trigger digestive discomfort for this population. It is important to note, though, if you do have celiac disease, sourdough is still not safe. Many sourdough breads in the US don't actually undergo this traditional long fermentation process, so they may not actually provide the same benefits for blood sugar control, nutrient absorption, or digestion. If you are eating a sourdough bread for health benefits, try making it on your own, or look from something from an artisan bakery or brands known for their more traditional methods. Otherwise, it's probably more similar to a traditional refined white bread. Okay, this has been a lot of information. Let's kind of summarize some of the most important things that we've taken away. All nutrient information cited is based on one serving of food. And please remember that the serving size is not a recommendation of how much you should eat. Percent daily value tells how much of a nutrient one serving of food contributes towards the total amount you need and should not surpass in a day. This is based on a 2,000 calorie diet and may not be accurate for everyone. For the fat profile, limit saturated and trans fats. Remember that 5% or less percent daily value represents a food low in saturated fat, while 20% or more represents a food high in saturated fat. For sodium, some people should try to limit their intake to less than 2,300 milligrams per day. The carbohydrate category includes fiber, total sugar, and added sugar, and the goal is to eat more fiber and to limit added sugar to less than 10% of total calorie intake. Ingredient lists show food ingredients in descending order by weight. Ingredients on the top of the list are seen in highest amounts, and ingredients on the bottom of the list are seen in lowest amounts. Longer lists don't immediately indicate that the food is unhealthy. And finally, marketing claims highlight appealing features to influence purchasing decisions, not always health. And while labeling claims provide standardized information about a product's nutrients or product methods and are more strictly regulated. However, neither of these really guarantee the overall health of a food. In summary, it's important to remember that at the end of the day, it's about balance, variety, and moderation. And food labels can guide choices, but should not become rigid rules. All right, any questions?
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but feel free to add any that you have, or you can unmute yourselves and share in person.
I have one question. Can I
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh can you go back to the conclusion slide? I had a small doubt in that. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
So you mentioned like the order of the order is like based on the decreasing value of the amount that
Uh,
particular thing is. So I see that first is total fat, which is 9 grams, but its daily percentage value is 12%. So so only the daily percentage value is based on the 2000 calorie count that they see. Is that correct? Because I
uh,
see like sodium is 37%. So it's like it's just based on the grams of that particular fat, cholesterol, sodium, etc. is not on the not based on the daily percentage value.
yeah, so that's a really good question. I think you may be confusing two different things. So, kind of going back. So the ingredient list, this is seen on the food label, usually below the list of specific like calcium, protein, all of those things. And this just lists out all the ingredients in the food. This is what is listed in order by weight. So cornmeal, highest weight, ferrous sulfide, iron, second highest weight. So this is organized by weight. When we're looking at that food label that you mentioned, sorry if this is making you nauseous. If we're looking at this food label, so let's take saturated fat, for example. One serving of this food has 4.5 grams of saturated fat. It's saying that that is 23% of the recommended daily value for someone that requires 2,000 calories per day. So if you're somebody that maybe requires more energy, let's say 3,000 calories per day, this 4.5 grams of saturated fat for you specifically may be like 18% of your daily value, right? That could change things. So these numbers are all standardized based on a 2,000 calorie diet. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect.
And
Uh-huh.
and these values are based on like a general person requirements, like if he has like a 2000 calorie diet. So the percentage daily value are based on that, right? And only the grams like saturated fat 4.5 grams, total fat 9 grams, these are for this particular product.
Yes.
Okay,
So
okay.
yes. So the all of the numbers here, like the total fat, cholesterol, sodium, these are all based on one serving of this frozen lasagna. The daily value is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. So for a person who requires 2,000 calories per day, if they had one serving of this frozen lasagna, that would be 12% of their recommended daily intake of, or sorry, 23% of their recommended daily intake of saturated fat.
Right. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question.
Any other questions today? If not, no worries. We're going to go ahead and post this along with our other presentations on the Student Health website. So that will be up there for you to review. And like May mentioned, you all are welcome to set up an individual appointment with either of us if you have any further like individual questions.
And our plan is to repeat this seminar series again in the fall. But like Jenna said, all of these recorded webinars are going to be posted on the nutrition page of the Student Health website. So if you ever want to go back and re-listen to anything, that information will all be available there.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.